Hey guys, I'd like to just start this video by saying thank you to everybody for watching all my videos, for subscribing, and for leaving me comments. I read every single one of them. My channel is small enough that I can interact with each and every one of you. It makes a big difference. You can influence the channel and you can help me out with constructive criticism. It's a great help. I'm still very new. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm awful at editing videos, I'm awful at talking, awful at filming, awful at pretty much everything. So anything you guys can do, things you'd like to see, things you think I could improve on, just let me know. Now, having said that, I've got an interesting one for you today. You may have seen, previously I made a Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. This is just a fake resin replica. It's actually quite accurate. This is the LA Toys? Whatever. But yeah, a few years ago I did make one of these Mjolnir hammers, and it was hollow, had 1/4 inch thick steel walls. It weighed about 25 pounds if I remember correctly. Now this time around we've got a really interesting one for you. Crazy build. I've been commissioned to build one of these hammers with a solid tungsten core. Now, if you're not familiar with tungsten, it is an extremely heavy, extremely hard substance. It's typically used for cutting blades, end mills and milling operations. You see them, saw blades, anything like that. Even my wedding ring is made out of tungsten. It's around 2.5 times as heavy as steel, if I remember correctly. It's 70% heavier than lead, for that matter. So extremely heavy, extremely expensive, extremely strong stuff. Now the plan is to get the tungsten core delivered. It's coming from a factory in Japan. It's my design. I did a 3D drawing of it, exactly the dimensions I want, slightly smaller than the actual hammer, and then I'm going to wrap the whole thing in steel and machine it all back so it basically looks perfect, or as close as I can get to perfect, but it'll be extremely heavy. So we're going for the Guinness Book of World Records here, and I'm also going to attempt to lift it at some point. We'll see how it goes. Now this is a brutal build. The last hammer I built was approximately 150 hours. It was the lengthiest project I've ever done. So I'm not really looking forward to this. It's excruciating. Every part of it is just awful to do. But it's worth it to make something this awesome. So when I was approached with this idea, I was on board. Alright guys, I've got you mounted up on the ceiling here. You're actually attached to one of the heating vents above my lathe. Hopefully I won't have my hands or especially the back of my head in the shot too much, but I'm just trying new angles right now. So first things first, we're going to work on the hardest part of the hammer, which is the pommel. Now when I made my first hammer a few years ago, I noticed that no one, to my knowledge, had tried to make an accurate one of these, and the reason why became very apparent very quickly, because this thing is a huge pain to make. It took me probably 5 attempts just to get a usable one the last time. So starting here first, this is going to be the hardest. What I've got here is a little piece of 1.5 inch round bar. This is cold rolled steel, 1018 steel. In fact, I've made it a little bit too long just so I have extra to chuck up in the lathe and so forth while I screw around more or less. But this is the same diameter. I'm just going to do this shape right here. Let's see if I can see this. This little angle in and then back out again right here. I'm going to do that on the lathe, and then I'm going to attempt the etchings. The etchings are by far the most problematic piece, so I don't want to, get too far in the creation process and just to screw it up. Once I have a piece with a good etching, then I'll do the rest of the work. Okay, so here we have it. This is the top of the pommel here. Let me bring in the replica. I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to see this, but I'm basically trying to match that groove, which I think I did. This top excess will get cut off later, but I got this groove, and this diameter is correct as well, so it's on to the etching. Alright, I think this side is good enough. This vinyl is actually an indoor vinyl. It's the kind of stuff you would stick on your wall and you can peel it off without the paint coming off. So when I paint nail polish over this, I'll be able to pull the vinyl off without it tearing the paint and sticking really hard and so forth. It will probably leave a little bit of adhesive behind, and that was a struggle I had last time. I'll have to try some new techniques to get all the adhesive up because it will block the etching process. That was kind of a tricky thing, especially since you can't really see it, but we'll figure it out. Alright, so I ended up turning off the camera because the work is too tedious, but this is looking pretty good. My only goal is to etch half this, so that's why I have everything else masked off. The reason why I'm only doing half is because I found that when you are etching something, there can't be any way to block the hydrogen bubbles from escaping when you're doing the etching. So in order to etch both sides, I had to stand it up last time, and the bubbles kind of were catching under this lip, this little lip, the black painted lip there, and it basically just looks really rough. Instead of a nice smooth surface that's etched, it's this, you know, grainy, rough portion. It wasn't too bad. I ended up just living with it after a little bit of sanding, but I'd rather avoid that this time around. So I got this little piece of wood glue gun to the top so that it can't roll on me. This is my salt water. I'm not an expert on etching, but my experience has told me that saturating the water with salt as much as possible is the best way to go. I tend to get very clean etches that way, and you can see there's actually salt sitting on the bottom. I've mixed this up probably 3 or 4 times, and the salt just keeps settling back in, so this is saturated as well as it's gonna get. I use kosher salt. Has no iodine in it, supposedly makes for better etches, and that's about it. I'm gonna float this resist. This is just some stainless steel with some, you know, pieces of wood glue gun to it. I'm gonna float it on top so I can face off or face against the material to be etched perfectly. Alright, so I ended up having a ton of trouble with this power supply. Ended up being faulty wiring, but I've gone through this probably 2 15-minute sessions and then 2 20-minute sessions, and that's where I'm at now. Let's see how this bad boy looks. I think that's gonna be it. The paint is just, not sure if you can really see the paint, just kind of comes off when I rub it. I don't know if you can see, yeah, you can see that etch line there. I'm going to clean this up and I'll come back. Alright, I hit it with some steel wool just to get all the paint off and everything. And as you can see, this came out almost perfectly. This is either lucky or variance or what, but there was a tiny little bit of pitting. Let's see if I can get this focus. Right there, just a tiny little bit. I can sand that down. And then a little bit of roughness right there and right there, but a little work with the die grinder. Oop, at the very top too. Got a little tiny chunk sticking out. I can clean that all up. I don't see anything glaring. Well, let's get this tape off the backside. I'll paint over this entire surface so it doesn't get etched again, and then I'll etch the other side of it. Alright guys, here we are. This is the second side. It came out nearly perfectly, I would say. The lines between the two etchings on the sides here matched up almost perfectly on that side too. Sorry, it's really hard to get this in the camera. It's, you know, you're doing it in reverse basically. I'm really happy with this. First try. It took me about 8 hours. And just for reference, the last time I did this hammer, it took me 4 tries to get this pommel done. So you can imagine the amount of time I invested before and why I was not looking forward to this at all. Alright, so my camera lost the audio for this clip, but all I'm really trying to show you here is that my etching was a pretty basic version of this design. You can see how complex it is here. It crosses over itself and it's got lots of separation. This is just a plain Jane version, so I need to manually draw all those intersecting lines and then carve them in with a Dremel and a little diamond cutoff wheel. Alright, that looks pretty good. There's enough depth in there that I'll weld this up. I'll plug weld it. I'll grind it back manually to a degree, and then I'll come back down here and stick it in the lathe. I'll bring you back for that. I'm not going to waste your time with 3 seconds of welding, basically. Alright, that's that. That's the end of the pommel finished. I got this little circle scribed in. I think everything looks good. It's just time to manually fix all this part and cut out these sections here. Well, I think she's all done for now. I just cleaned it up with the wire brush. This side had a little bit of pitting. You can see it in this area. The rest of the etching looks pretty good. Pretty happy with it. Top is good. This side did better on the etching. Very smooth surface, but the etching up here was kind of rough. Neither side is perfect, I guess. I think I'm pretty happy with it. Alright, I lied. While I was filming that last spot, I saw 4 little pinholes, and I went back and I welded them in and ground them all back, and I don't see any anymore. Okay, now I'm really happy with it. So we're almost there. We've got the side windows for the leather strap. You can kind of see them in there. I'm just about done, but in the interest of full disclosure, I'm going to show you a problem I have encountered. Now, when I was doing all the cutting and grinding in this area, I had put this little nut on the threads. So you can do this left-handed. That's way harder than it should be. I wanted to protect the threads from the cutting blades and so forth, because if I damaged the threads, I could have a real problem. And if luck would have it, I have a real problem. As you can see, this is as far as this nut goes. It's very tight after this. Can't really see it too well, but if you look very closely at the threads, they're supposed to be pointed, and these ones are, but down there, you really can't see it. I don't really have enough light, but the rest of the threads look like they're almost rounded over. Not really sure what happened. When I inserted this bolt from the other side and then welded over it, or that I had tapped this hole just to kind of keep it perfectly straight and to give it a little more mechanical advantage to keep it in there. I suspect the threads got messed up somehow, and as I threaded this bolt in, it slightly screwed up the threads on this bolt. So now I'm kind of screwed. This is all done, as you saw earlier. My only real hope here, well, I shouldn't say that. I have several options. In fact, I just bought about $300 worth of tools and had them rushed to deliver to my house because this is kind of holding up the project at this point. One of the things I ordered was this, and this is the first thing I'm going to try. Looks like a standard die. You can see it's got teeth in there for cutting threads. This is just a rethreading die, so it's not meant to cut new threads. It's just meant to clean up and repair old threads if you've got rusty fasteners or something like that. That's the first thing I'm going to try. I could just use a normal die. This is a standard die used for actually cutting those threads. The problem is these are all 1 inch, and while I can fit this in here, I don't have any way of turning it. It barely clears. And if I had used a 1 inch socket, which will encapsulate that, the problem is it does not fit, so there's not a whole lot of wall left in there. I'd have to turn it down on the lathe and hope it fits or something like that, but hopefully it doesn't come to that. Well, that was that. That was really anticlimactic, and I guess I didn't need the $300 worth of tools, but I wanted to have every available option in case the rethreading didn't work and then the tapping didn't work, and I bought 2 of every tool as well in case I broke some. I just really couldn't waste time, screwing around with it. But yeah, that little rethreading die removed a tiny bit of material, and now this just threads on literally 2 fingers, and they're covered in grease and oil from trying to cut the threads. Alright, so one last thing. Now, through all the stages of etching and then hand grinding and sanding and so forth, these designs have gotten fairly shallow. You can see them fairly well on camera and in real life because lighting is really good in here and I'm holding them directly up to the camera, but I've noticed with faint designs like this in pictures and in real life, they can kind of get lost a little bit, especially some spots that are really shallow. So what people normally do in this situation is commonly called a rub and buff. You would take some black acrylic paint and just paint it over the surface, and then without letting it dry, you just kind of rub it off, and it stays in all the little cracks and all the edges of the design and so forth, and it just kind of helps it pop a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing, except I'm going to use some gun blue. If you haven't heard of gun blue, I've used it several times in several different builds. It's actually a black oxide treatment, so instead of adding something to the surface like paint, it just changes the color of the steel. Very shallow depth, maybe, I think it might be about 2/1000ths of an inch. That's half the width of a human hair, and I think it actually might be less than that, but it'll give you a convincing black without having something that can just be scraped off the surface. We're not changing anything about the steel, with staying exactly the same. And I'll just have to Scotch-Brite it off. Full disclosure, I did steal that idea from Michael Cthulhu. That's a great idea, Mike. than just using paint that comes off easily. The gun blue is much more durable, and I think it even looks a little bit better. Alright, boys and girls, here it is. I took the Scotch-Brite and polished most of it off. I may polish it more in the future. I think it looks pretty good right now, and you can see even from arm's length that design really stands out. It's not perfect, but I'm pretty happy with it. You can see the leather straps just kind of crosses over itself, and the two slots are actually slightly offset so that I can put one strap down, one strap up. You can't really tell unless you're looking for it, but it helps with stacking these two pieces. I fully anticipate this strap will hold the weight of the hammer, by the way. I did pick out a few different kinds of leather, and this was the thickest and kind of stiffest, heaviest leather I could find. It's almost 3/4 of an inch wide. It's actually wider than that. It's probably 20 millimeters or so, and it's about 1/10 of an inch thick, maybe a little less than 3 millimeters. So it's some pretty heavy duty stuff. It kind of feels like shoelace leather, I guess. So it's some tough stuff. Alright, so now for something relatively easy. We're going to make this circular runic top plate for the hammer. Now, to cut out this perfect circle, it's about 3 inches, 308, I believe is what I measured it at. Now this is a 3 1/4 inch hole saw, and the internal diameter is about 3 1/8, 3.125. So I've got about 40 thousandths of an inch, basically buffer room, that I can kind of sand and polish and make that exactly the right size. If this ends up a little small, I do have a 3 1/2 inch, but that would require quite a bit more work. And honestly, using a hole saw this big on steel with my wimpy drill press is not that great. It's going to be very slow and a lot of chatter, but I've done it before, so we'll do it again. Alright, so we're down here in the drill press dungeon, and I happened to find the exact piece of steel that I've cut these pieces out of before. You can see there's two over here, and then these two are actually plasma cut attempts. I don't know if you can see. Yeah, they're kind of crappy plasma cut attempts. It just wasn't accurate enough, so I stopped doing that, but I've got enough room for more, so this is 3/16 thick. It's about 4.5 millimeters. So what tends to happen when using a large hole saw to cut out steel is you end up getting almost all the way through, and then the drill just kind of starts seizing up more or less. There's just too much surface area touching, and it doesn't have the power to just keep going. It keeps binding up more or less. But you can see if I flip this over, I actually made it almost all the way through. You can see the lines where it's just starting to kind of deform the steel on the other side of the cut. Not so much up there, but the piece of steel must be slightly canted underneath the drill here. So it's only cutting, you know, at a very slight angle, but I'm just going to flip it over and just finish the cut from here because I'm basically getting deadlocked at this point. Here we go. Not too bad. Let's measure it and let's see what we got. Alright, so this turned out pretty well. It's very slightly undersized. I just measured it. I think it was 29 thousandths of an inch. That's, I think, 3/4 of a millimeter. It's not something I'm exactly gonna cry about. So I've got this vinyl template cut out for the runes on the edges there. Now if you look very closely, some of the pieces are very small and we're not able to transfer. So I printed out a copy, and you can see that word right there. It's missing a few little central pieces, but they just don't stick. So I'm going to put this template on there, and then I have cut down this little paintbrush to almost nothing, and I will use this to paint with the nail polish those little tiny missing bits there. So hopefully I'll get nice accurate etching. One quick side note, I had a lot of trouble the last time I did this lining up this circular design and spacing it correctly. If it's off center by even the tiniest bit, you can tell, because there's almost no gap between the letters and the outside of the circle. So if it's off by, you know, a tiny fraction of an inch, like a 32nd of an inch, less than a millimeter, you can still see it with your naked eye. So I centered a little 1/4 inch hole, and I'll line it up with that hole. In fact, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a 1/4 inch drill bit, stick it through there, and stick that on like so. So that'll allow me to line it up at least as good as it's going to get. There we go. I've got the hand painted little bits, basically, just to kind of fill out the letters. I only really screwed it twice, and I was able to scrape off the paint with the X-Acto. The worst one is that one. The rest of them look pretty good. And I did paint 2 coats all along the edges just to protect and insulate the edges from getting etched. Alrighty, it's the next day. Everything seems nice and dry, and I've got full coverage on every surface, so let's dip this bad boy in the salt water and let's see how it goes. Alright, let's do 2 amps for 20 minutes. As far as how I came up with that number, it's pretty much just a random guess. It's not a whole lot of material to be etched, so I suspect it'll go pretty quickly. Alright, let's see what we got here. Alright, so here we go. It came up pretty well. There's a tiny bit of pitting, basically, up here where the vinyl and the nail polish met, and it must have just gotten a little bit under there, but that can be sanded out. The hand-drawn center part of these letters, a little, you know, the center of the P or whatever that's supposed to be, those actually all came out very well. But yeah, I'm pretty happy, I would say. There was just a little indentation. I don't know if you can see that. That's where the wire was coming out, and despite me trying to seal that off, a little bit of the etchant got under there, but this is going to lay flat like this. You'll never see it. Thankfully, it's not even that close to the edge. So one final note, if you remember, I had taken a different strategy trying to center the etching on this piece, and I ended up running into the exact same problem regardless. You can see these letters are very close to the edge, and these letters have a slight gap down here. And what I did is I very carefully, with some accurate calipers, I measured the center hole to this edge, and it was about 40 thousandths of an inch less than center hole to this edge, which means this hole is literally not centered. I suspect my drill press and the hole saw I was using must have enough run out in it that it doesn't spin perfectly round. You would never really notice it except for in situations like this. So I got my etching placed correctly, but the hole is actually off center. Unfortunately, I don't really know of any way to get around this. My equipment just isn't accurate enough for that. You know, that's 1 millimeter difference basically, that this hole is off. Alright, so as usual, I can't leave well enough alone, so after very carefully measuring this, I realized it wasn't actually round at all in the first place, which was half the problem. This hole was not centered, and the outside diameter was not round either. So very carefully manually sanded this round. It's very close. It's good enough, I would say. and now I have less of an issue with the visible gaps between the edge and the lettering. You can see it's pretty much the same top and bottom. It's very tight on the right and places on the left as well, so I think it looks a lot better. I did drill some holes for these plug welds, and finally I did the gun bluing trick in the letters, so they kind of stand out a lot better now. This one's done, I think.